Hi, welcome back to the Craft Beer Runner. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We have my friend Leah on. We're going to talk about climate and climate change. Leah has been working in the green industries in consulting mostly since she got her master's degree in environmental sciences or environmental policy, correct? Environmental policy. Okay, and you worked for the Tennessee Valley Authority originally, before moving out to Seattle, that's where I met you in Seattle. And since you've been here, you've worked for Built Green, which is a lobbying or a industry. How would you describe it?
Yeah, it's an industry association, but it was a green home certification program.
Okay, great. And then currently you work for Climate Solutions, which is an Oregon and Washington organization, and you're currently doing Washington transportation policy, is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and just for transparency, we're filming this the first weekend of October up here in the Pacific Northwest. Up until recently, we've had some bad bouts of smoke. About 2 weeks ago, it was just not even breathable. You couldn't even go outside to exercise. And we had that for about 2 weeks. Everything cleared out for a while, and we had a little bump in our AQI this week as some smart smoke came into Seattle from Oregon and Northern California. But for the most part, it never topped the unhealthy mark on the scale. So we've been quite lucky. So I wanted to bring Leah on today. She's super knowledgeable and she's super involved, and just want to kind of let her talk. So first, what got you into environmental policy? Why did you want to pursue your master's degree in that?
Yeah, it's something that as a kid, I've always been really interested in, though in sort of different shades. When I was a child, early on, climate wasn't really a conversation, right? But I really was into, save the animals and what I think a lot of children are into, but that sort of ethos just stuck with me. And I grew up in Kentucky, and actually when I was young, I saw strip mining happening. And it's a very shocking visual. And you literally just see machinery tearing up the earth and hurting people. Folks who live in these areas often don't have potable water. When kids take baths, they have to close their eyes really tight so the water doesn't get in their eyes because it's very acidic. It's obviously highly polluting. And I think that sort of just stuck with me. So throughout college, I took a lot of different environmental science, environmental policy classes. Climate was then becoming a conversation. An Inconvenient Truth came out my first year in college. And so, of course, that really brought climate more onto the national conversation. And it's something that, I think a lot of my passions for human rights, honestly, like really intersect with environmental policy and with climate. There's environmental justice and climate justice are hugely important issues. And I think I'm also a pretty holistic thinker and just naturally like to sort of tie things together. And I think climate change is a issue that really does that. We need to fix climate change in order to help fix a lot of other disparities and vice versa. And so I think it's just something that sort of suited me and I felt really passionate about. And so after college, I went straight into my master's program in environmental policy just because I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I'm really glad I did, because I'm super thankful that right now I'm able to, earn my living advocating for climate policies in Washington State. It's super. So.
Right, and so, like I said, did your master's degree, you went to Tennessee Valley Authority, then came out to Washington, worked in the housing industry on the green side, and now you're working on the transportation policy so do you want to talk a little bit about what you do for Climate Solutions? What exactly does it mean that you're the Washington transportation manager? What's that mean?
Yeah. So at Climate Solutions, I'm on the policy team, which means I help research policy, write policy, advocate and lobby for policy in Olympia at the state legislature, and also some different local governments really work on trying to implement policies at the intersection of climate and transportation. So in addition to that, I do some research on, for example, we just released a report on pathways to decarbonize our transportation sector. What is it going to take in terms of electrifying our vehicle fleet and also reducing vehicle miles traveled and getting more people to take transit or walk or bike to get around? And what of those things in combination will get us to our goals of carbon reductions by 2050? So it really runs the gamut, but I would say the core of my job is policy advocacy and really trying to create coalitions that will get us wins in Olympia and get policies passed.
Right. So I think the conversation around transportation, at least on the green side, it's kind of twofold because you have the urban conversation, like people that live in cities, and then you also have the suburban and rural conversation because you do have a lot of people that don't necessarily have access to transportation based on affordability because they can't afford to live in cities, but that's where the jobs are and they live further outside. Do you want to talk a little bit on the suburban and rural side, what people can do, and also like what kind of policies should we be focusing on to really reduce our carbon footprint?
Yeah. So there's a whole layer of issues involved here. Like you said, the cost issue. It's really expensive to live in a city and to live in Seattle. And we've even seen the suburbanization of poverty, where folks who used to live in the urban core because of prices have been pushed further and further out, and then are forced in the areas where there's no transit or no good transit that works for them, and then they are forced to drive. I grew up in a rural area, by the way, like where I grew up, transit score 0, walk score 0. I grew up on a long, windy country road, no sidewalk, nothing, right? And so I do think it's important to develop policies that increase the amount of housing in cities. So more folks can live in cities, so it's more affordable, and more people are going to be in areas where they will have access to transit or where they can walk or bike to get around. And I think having safe infrastructure for folks to walk and bike is important. But that said, our land use policies for the past 70 years have really incentivized sprawl. And we're just in a situation where right now a lot of folks don't live where they can access transit, which is a problem for the environment and also for folks who for some reason or another are unable to drive, right? So that said, I think, as I was talking about our research earlier, in terms of climate, we are facing such an emergency. We need to reduce our emissions so quickly that I think we really need to use every tool in the toolbox. And so given our current sort of land use situation, I think it's really important to, yes, we need to electrify all of the vehicles that are on the road, but also, especially where it makes sense in urban and suburban areas, really boost our transit system and make it easier for people not to have to drive in the first place. But we need to use both strategies, right? Because within 10 years, we're not going to have everybody living in an urban environment where there's access to transit. That's just not how our land use policies are designed over time. So I think pursuing both of those strategies is super important. And one other thing I wanted to flag is that comes down at a policy level. I think the transportation sector is one area that really shows how we cannot rely on individual choice to solve the climate crisis, because our individual choices are so constrained by the system. We really need to change the system in order to help solve this crisis. Like if you live in a rural area and you have no choice but to drive around to get around, which is how I grew up, you might not have the money to purchase an electric vehicle right now, or if you do, maybe you have to drive longer distances and you can't count on having a reliable charger at your workplace, right? There's all these different factors that sort of play into it where people are making choices under, a very constrained system. And so we want to change that system and make it easy for folks in rural areas to very easily afford electric vehicles, to very easily be able to charge them no matter what kind of trips that they're taking. And then in urban areas, obviously, make it very easy to opt for transit or feel safe biking, just getting around. So providing those sustainable systems, I think, is really key. And it takes policy to do that.
Right. And do you think there'll be some changes in terms of the work from home situation that's happening right now because of COVID-19? I know a lot of major companies are changing their policy at least through October of next year, so another year. And then some companies, major companies like Twitter and other companies have decided to allow a more permanent work from home situation when feasible. Do you think this will also, at least in the short term, help reduce some of these needs on our transportation system?
Somewhat. It is sort of a complicated answer though. I do absolutely agree, like we are going to see more working from home. What we did see, however, during the height of the pandemic here, when traffic was really shut down, our overall global emissions they didn't dip down that much. And part of the issue is, look at our electricity grid, look at our manufacturing. There are all these levers that we don't really have control over. Also, increased freight transportation because people are ordering more, right? They're ordering their groceries, they're ordering from
Yeah.
Amazon, that kind of thing. So you have all these freight vehicles on the road. So I do think the flexibility to telework is beneficial in some ways, and I think it's great. And I think folks should have, I'm really a proponent of broadband for all to make sure that people have the option, to telework if that functions at their job, or just in order to access the internet and do things. But at the same time, it is also important to consider that a lot of folks have to be on site to work. And one problem that we have experienced is due to lower ridership on transit, we are seeing cuts in routes. We're seeing less revenue for our transit system. And that makes it especially hard for those essential workers who use transit to get to work. And so it's sort of a conundrum in that, it's great to have more people teleworking if they're able to and if they want to in the long run, but there's really no substitute for funding a good transit system to make sure folks who do rely on it are able to get around easily.
I want to transition slowly to cities, but I think there's a halfway point between what we're talking about with suburban and rural and what we're going to the city. And what you were talking about with broadband for all, and one thing that's happened with COVID is a lot of learning from home, school from home. And at least in my anecdotal viewpoint, or observation, I should say, one of the biggest polluters out there is school buses.
Mm-hmm.
So like right now, it's, the school bus is not running, it kind of helps, in the short term. Is there policies in the state of Washington going on about electrifying school buses or hybrids or some way of reducing the pollution?
Yeah, so actually, Franklin Pierce School District just, I want to say about a year ago, introduced the first electric school bus in Washington. And school buses are actually a really good application for electric vehicles, right? They run their route, and then they sit and can charge, and then they run their route. And so it's great for a lot of levels. There's obviously the climate pollution element. There's the air pollution element, and diesel is super toxic, and kids' lungs are not fully developed, and so they're even more susceptible. So there has been legislation introduced in Olympia. Unfortunately, it hasn't passed yet, but it is about limiting diesel pollution for school buses. But another really great thing that we passed in 2019 was granting all utilities, public and private utilities, electric utilities, the authority to create transportation electrification plans. And what those plans are sort of depends on the utility. We have some utilities who are just now designing their plans to implement, but that is a way where a public utility, for example, say Tacoma Power or Seattle City Light, would be able to work with school districts and help them by giving them incentives or rebates for their charging by either the infrastructure, or give them a sort of a preferential rate. And that would really make it a lot easier for a school to afford the upfront cost of the electric school bus, but then they would recoup the cost because paying for electricity to get around is much, much, much cheaper than paying for fuel, liquid fuel like gas or diesel to get around. So electric school buses are huge. And I also want to, sort of, when I talk about electric vehicles, a lot of times people immediately, like, their minds go to like personal vehicles and Tesla, but we need to electrify everything that's on the road. And that includes school buses, that includes, transit buses, it includes garbage trucks, freight delivery.
Right,
And so
especially
I
freight, both short,
yeah.
both final mile, but also long haul. I think
Mm-hmm.
living in Seattle, living in a major port, like one of the biggest ports in the U.S., and at least on the West Coast, obviously, Los Angeles and Southern California and San Francisco also. But, as you go through downtown, you see so much pollution, and you see a lot of trucks just idling, and you see, the trains are polluting, and it's a lot of freight is a huge industry here. Logistics is a huge industry here, and so I think living in Seattle, we're a lot more aware of the overall pollution going in. I mean, you just see tons of trucks on the road.
Yeah, and I will sort of point out too, there's an important environmental justice issue here. So if you live in the Duwamish Valley, your life expectancy is 13 years shorter on average than somebody who lives in Laurelhurst. So for folks who aren't in Seattle, Laurelhurst is a wealthy neighborhood, and the Duwamish Valley is right by the port. It's right by a lot of industry, and it's right by an interstate. And so
It's
you have
where
this
this beer
confluence.
is from, actually.
Yeah, yeah. So you have this confluence of pollution, and frankly, in these areas, due to racist housing policies and redlining, you're more likely to see folks of color who live in these highly polluted areas. And for those in Washington, I would recommend checking out. There's if you just Google it, the Washington Environmental Health Disparities Map, and will actually show what kinds of folks, what kinds of communities are living in certain places, and then what the pollution level looks like. And it's really shocking how
I'll put a
those two
link to
things come
that
together.
below on this.
Cool. Yeah. So all that to say is that, back to the subject of the port, that pollution really is something that needs to be cleaned up. And it's a matter of, protecting our climate and averting a climate crisis, but it's also a matter of improving the health for folks who have done nothing to cause this problem, but are really bearing the brunt of these pollution and suffering from, health issues and the related costs as a result.
Right. And so, yeah, we were talking about electrifying school. One of the reasons why I was saying anecdotally observations, I remember as a kid, like on a school bus, if I was in Los Angeles, so LUSD, just lines of, you might have not had that in Kentucky, you might have just had one bus for the whole city, but, you had the lines of buses, and as soon as they all turn them on and start driving, the black smoke, goes into the buses with bad ventilation, and then, you just smell on the next bus. You're left in basically a trail of just black smoke.
Yeah,
it's
really bad. Yeah, and it's so unhealthy for kids. And so, one thing I like to also point out to folks is as we address climate pollution, we are also addressing air pollution. And that is huge. Obviously it benefits our health. It has a lot of financial impacts related to, health costs. And, one question that, a lot of folks ask, especially since I focus on state level work at the moment, when I'm in Olympia, sometimes people will say, well, Washington can sort of do this thing that's good for the climate, but if other people don't, then it doesn't matter for the climate, which, on one hand, it's going to take all of us, but that means we can't opt out either. It's going to take all of us, but you can't do it without us. But also, as we address climate pollution, we are immediately reaping the benefits from improved health here. So even if we don't address the climate crisis, which we need to, it's literally a crisis, but we can, in the short term, really improve our health and our well-being by doing so. So it's important to keep that in mind and keep those connections between our health and climate policy in mind.
Yeah, and I think this is also the link between people that care about the environment and, I hate to use the word believe in climate change, but people that are advocates for, reducing climate change.
They recognize climate science and understand climate science.
Yeah, but this is the link to those that are more make the economics argument but I think they're somehow why would you not want to have clean air and clean water? It affects everyone. It does disproportionately affect people of color and people in lower income brackets for sure. But why wouldn't you want clean air? I grew up in Los Angeles, and I grew up fortunately in a period where the air quality was better than the decade before. So the 80s and 90s, in the 70s and 60s, the air quality in LA was really bad, and they had warnings and all that. And the period of time I was there as a kid, it was improved. It wasn't great, but it was improved, and we never had these warnings. And then slowly the air it's getting worse and worse down there again. Just LA just has a lot of other issues, and it dates back to tearing up all the miles of tracks they had. They had a great trolley system that could have been a great light rail system. Let's not talk about that.
Yeah.
Oh man, sad, definitely. Yeah, so uh, so now we're going from electric school buses, electrifying like ports and stuff like that. So now let's get into the cities themselves. Uh, you know, what can be done in the short term? Like, what can people do that that's not policy wise? I mean, I know you're saying there's a lot of things that are policy based, and a lot of the
Mhm.
decisions we can't control because of policy. But like, what can people living in the city do?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a few things, and I would sort of say, people can help shape the system through advocacy, right? And so I think that's a really important thing. Like, if you are, for example, like if you want to bike around, but you're afraid to, like, there's a point of advocacy for you. You can talk to your local government and be like, look, there's not safe bike infrastructure near me. This something needs to be fixed. In Seattle right now, I should plug, coming up on the ballot in November is a transit measure to help fund transit. It's renewing a measure that we have already had. So if we don't renew the measure, we're going to see big cuts to our bus service. So absolutely vote yes on transit on the Seattle ballot. And it's going to be way down toward the bottom. So don't stop voting, go through the whole ballot.
Right, and I think it's also important just about why elections matter in general, and it's not just
Yeah.
the federal election. Why every election, including small elections, matter because in many states these propositions, the direct democracy is on every ballot, whether it's an April ballot with three things on it, like someone you've never even heard of, and then two propositions, including maybe like funding the fire department, and there'll be stuff on here that can affect bikes, transportation,
Yeah.
or health in general. And so, for me, I think I've maybe missed three total elections in my 22 years of voting, and they're all minor elections. But I grew up in a family where voting was super important, and so like I've made a point in my life to always um, submit a ballot.
Yeah. I mean, it's having done some work at the local level as well through my current job and also just in sort of general advocacy. For example, I'm on the local Sierra Club group in Seattle, and we do a lot of advocacy around sort of urban policy, urbanism, urban transportation, affordable housing in the city, and who your local electeds are is super important. That makes a really big difference. So even voting in the primary, like don't forget that. Look up who the candidates are and who better represents your values. So I would encourage everybody, to view advocacy as a climate action for starters, but also in your personal life, yeah, consider trying to walk a little bit more. Consider trying to bike if you have safe enough infrastructure near you. I know for some folks that's scary, and I totally get it. Try to take transit more if you're able to, and sort of build a schedule around that. I think you know just trying to do what you can, but also not putting too much pressure on yourself when it's too hard. I also think that's important. I think a lot of people get really wrapped up in things, and so that's why I think advocacy is such an important outlet, because when it is hard, right, you need to change the system. But yeah, and sort of on individual actions, there's a lot of other things. Like, I think talking to your friends is another huge thing, right? Elevating the issue so other folks are also being ready to advocate. So yeah, I always come back to advocacy because, again, I think that's such a crucial thing. Like, me reducing my personal carbon footprint is such a drop in the bucket. But if we have somebody who's elected president or elected to the Senate who's a climate champion, like, that can make a massive difference. So it's really important to get involved in politics, in my opinion. Yeah.
One of my favorite tools that is kind of an obvious thing, and some people might not know what you can do with it, is Google Maps. Because on Google Maps, not only can you, when you type in two addresses, it gives you the driving directions, but there's also a pedestrian option. It gives you multiple pedestrian routes. And in many cities, it has a public transit option that also it's not necessarily in every city, but I know like in Seattle it is. It has time maps. It actually, so if you type in, where you want to go, and you can plan it in advance too, it will tell you, what time the bus is going to show up. It's not just take this bus. It is buses will show up this way, and and I think that's an awesome tool that people can use to help reduce the unknown of public transportation for someone that hasn't really taken it much.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, because I think there is some negative connotation to two things: micromobility and even public transportation, specifically buses. So, like in Los Angeles it has one of the best bus systems in the country. It's actually been awarded top, not, I think last year Seattle won the top, or King County won top metro bus. But in the past 10 years, LA has been one of the top bus systems. But I think a lot of, and when I say a lot of people, I mean mostly white, affluent people don't take buses. They're okay taking light rail. But there's a negative connotation with buses in Los Angeles. That like, there's not that connotation in New York. New York, public transportation. People take subway. They take the bus. It doesn't matter. But in LA, there's a very negative connotation to it. And the same with micromobility. And I think there's a lot of people that turn their nose up at scooters, e-scooters, and at bikes, and government officials too. I know the new policies in Seattle for scooters is actually making it almost impossible for them to succeed. So what can us as individuals do to do a better job advocating and reducing these fears of micromobility and buses? And to clarify, because I know you and I both know what micromobility is, but micromobility is stuff like e-bikes, bicycles in general, scooters, things that aren't cars that have wheels that will take you from point A to point B. One of my buddies created a company called Solo Wheel, which is basically it's the size of a briefcase. It's an electric wheel that it's kind of like a Segway technology, but it's just a single wheel. And so yeah, I mean, there's stuff like that out there. So like, what can people do to reduce their fears of these things?
Yeah. So, and I will say, when, like I mentioned, when I grew up in a rural area, and there wasn't buses, right? I never took the bus. And it wasn't really until I moved out to Seattle that I started regularly taking the bus. And so I appreciated your point about Google Maps. And I would just encourage folks, at first, the bus system, if you've never used it, can seem a little bit overwhelming, but maybe ask a friend to map it out with you one time and give it a try. Once you've got it, it's really easy. And I would say for me, I think about the bus as a way to get my time back. If I'm commuting, I used to have a pretty long commute. Either way, it was long if I was taking the bus, it was long if I was driving. And at least when I was on the bus, guess what? I can sit back, I can read, I can play on my phone, I can listen to music, whatever it is, right? If I'm in the car, I would arrive so stressed out because of this horrible drive and this horrible congestion, and I could not do anything else, right? I had to concentrate on the road. And so I would encourage folks to think about their time and how they want to spend their time. And, I've always, whether I've, taken transit to work, like I just find myself in a better mood when I get there because I'm able to do something that I enjoy, like reading. I got through a lot more books when I was, commuting into the office. So, I would encourage people to think about that. And, also I've one fun story I should tell is, buses can really bring folks together, or just public transit in general. And so when I moved out to Seattle, I was riding the bus home from work one day, and I saw this woman who looked super familiar to me, and it took a sec to place her. And I had studied abroad with her almost a decade prior in Russia, and she was on the same bus as me. And so I went up to her, I was like, Allie? And it took her a second, and then she recognized me. And, I didn't realize that she lived in Seattle now, and because she is not originally from here, and I'm not either. And yeah, we literally had this chance meeting on a bus, and we connected, and ever since, like, we've been hanging out, we're doing Russian lessons together. So like we really rekindled a friendship. And so, I just want to sort of throw out there that, when you're by yourself in a car, you're kind of isolating yourself, and you sort of close off the opportunity that you would have to, have these different sort of chance happenings. So I would sort of posit that as well. And, I do want to highlight that, as a woman, for me, it can be a little bit uncomfortable sometimes on public transportation, but it's not any different than any other public space. It's certainly not different than when I'm in a parking garage, right? And so that's an unfortunate reality. And if folks feel uncomfortable, like, I think there's a lot of ways to sort of help with that, like sit near the driver and things like that. I've had really great drivers. Like, bus drivers tend to be really super people, I will say. So, I know a lot of women can be sort of intimidated by that factor, but there are definitely ways to address that if you're nervous. And I don't find it any worse than any other place, unfortunately. So.
At least in major cities, the buses also have cameras and audio
Mhm.
recording as well for your safety.
They
They
do.
also, here in Seattle, there's a phone number you can text if you see something to report it. There are things like that. And yeah, no, I do hear you about your concerns as a woman. Um,
And I will say too, when you're on transit, like there's other people who can help you, right? Like,
you know,
you have to be willing to sort of say, hey, knock it out or speak up, but there's other people on there who will surround you. I would find that much safer than walking by myself, honestly. Like there's other people around. So that's a plus.
so what can we do to um, decrease the stigma of micromobility? I don't know
Yeah.
whether you go into next door and you have people
Oh my
complaining
God.
about
I
bikes
know.
everywhere or the scooters. This is going to create more deaths and injuries. And like, what can we do to decrease the stigma?
Yeah, I think part of it is, it's really easy for people to sort of not compare. It's really easy for people to not look at the problems of the status quo because they're used to it, right? But yeah, so there's scooters parked around. Guess what's also parked around, taking even more space, right? Cars are taking up way more space. You know what hits people all the time? There was just a pedestrian death, I think last night near me, right? Like cars kill people all the time. So the more people you have who are using scooters and bikes rather than personal vehicles, the safer it actually is going to be for everybody, and the less space is going to be taken up, right? All those little vehicles replacing a car is a pretty amazing thing in terms of safety, in terms of air pollution, in terms of space, and utilizing urban space for people rather than vehicle storage. So I would encourage people to sort of flip the script a little bit, and also just share your own story. Like and I'll bring up the running connection. We know each other from running, and back when we were doing running groups, we would run from a local brewery, and I would often run to the brewery, and we would go on a run, and then afterward we'd have a beer. And I didn't always want to run home after that, right? Like I was cold at that point, and I'd had a couple of beers, didn't want to jiggle them in my stomach, and I often would get a shared bike and just zoom home. It would take 5 minutes. It'd cost maybe like $1.50, save me a bunch of time. And it was just so convenient. And so also when I was working downtown, often I'd have to zip around downtown from meeting to meeting with, other organizations. And I could walk, and sometimes I would, but if I really had to scoot from one place to another, like having an e-bike there like really helped me out. And I would see other folks, working downtown in like business suits doing that too, right? Because they have the electric assist, you don't get sweaty. And just, I would encourage people to also share their stories about how they've been so much more convenient for them. So yeah, I think a combination of those factors, like if somebody's really adverse, connect it to yourself and say, well, hang on a second, like I actually use these things, and you like me and trust me, and I benefit from them. But then also pointing out the flaws in our current system, and how actually the more folks who do shift out of personal vehicles, it's actually better for everybody. That reduces congestion and improves safety and all that.
Yeah, and I think one thing that actually increased the popularity of the shared bike system here in Seattle was the e-bikes in being introduced,
Mm-hmm.
because many people that I'm not sure what people's perception of Seattle is in terms of topography, but Seattle is hillier than San Francisco. If you think San Francisco hills, they're way worse in Seattle. The grades are steeper. They're everywhere you can't avoid them. And originally, the shared bike program, there was 3 companies out here, and none of them had e-bikes, and it would make it difficult to ride up. You'd have to. There's some hills on. If you're using a 1-speed bike, you're not getting up some of these hills. So when they introduced the e-bikes to the fleet and actually replaced all the fleets with it, it made them more popular because you could actually get around Seattle on them.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah,
it's also, I would point out too, it's an accessibility issue, right? Like not everybody necessarily is an amazing, sort of cyclist in terms of strength for one reason or another.
yeah,
And yeah, it opens the doors for so many people. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I'm sorry, I sweat a lot if I'm exercising. And so if I'm going meeting to meeting, I don't really want to be sweating. So the e-bikes are great. Like I can just wear my work clothes and zip along and then, park it and not have to worry about taking the time to lock up my own bike either.
I have one more question for you, policy-wise, or about policy in general, before we start to get away from this. We can wrap up this conversation. One thing we've been promised, whether in Seattle, whether in Los Angeles, whether across the country, the U.S. is behind the rest of the world when it comes to high-speed rail. And the cost of high-speed rail and the time frame to get high-speed rail is ridiculous. It's astronomical. What policy-wise, what can be done to speed these projects up and to maybe even reduce costs or find the benefit of these programs?
Yeah, I mean it's a tough question because you're right. Like the time frames are so far out. The cost is really high. I mean, even if you're not looking at high speed rail, but you're looking at the build out of our light rail system in the Seattle area, which our light rail system, like I love that it exists. It's amazing. I want more of it. But man, like if you were to interpose our light rail system with a system of say like London or Paris, it's like a whole different story,
We moved to West Seattle 2 years ago, July. So we've been in West Seattle almost 2.5 years now. And when we moved here, we kind of like looked at the light rail, like what the plan is. We're not earmarked to get light rail still for 14, 15 years. And that's assuming the budget stay the same as is and not be reduced as we're talking about. And they still haven't figured out how they're going to bring the light rail to West Seattle because, the West Seattle Bridge, which is out, it was too steep of a bridge to put light rail on top of. It was built improperly. And the $100 million they're talking about building the new bridge with, the Coast Guard wants them to build the bridge even higher. So you're not going to be able to put the light rail on the bridge. So the other option is, do you create a drawbridge and you put light rail on a drawbridge? You tunnel, which is excessive cost for no reason. Like, it's insane. And this is still 15 plus years out, for something that's needed 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of things here. And I would say there's sort of 2 points is that we need more revenue, we need more money, and also priorities, right? So on the priorities piece, most of our transportation budget goes toward roads, either preservation and maintenance, which fine, I want our roads to be safe, right? Don't want our bridges to collapse. I was like,
well, that's what we're having right now in West Seattle.
Yes, exactly. But there's quite a lot of dollars that goes toward, highway expansion projects. A lot of money. That's a lot of money. So, there's sort of what are we prioritizing in terms of our infrastructure? And then on the revenue side, I mean, right now our transportation revenue is really constrained, especially if you're talking about revenue for other modes, because the main, about 50%, about half of our transportation revenue comes from the gas tax. Those dollars can only be spent on highway purposes. So we're in this negative feedback loop of half of our revenue has to be spent on roads. And the other modes have fewer revenue options available to them. And the revenue question of transportation in Washington, it's not just a transportation revenue question. It's an overall revenue question, right? Washington is a very regressive tax code. We don't have an income tax. We are struggling to pay for a lot of things because we have a broken tax code here in Washington. So I would bring up those couple of things of like, we need to fix our broken systems so we have folks who can afford to pay in a little bit more. We have the 2 richest people in the world here. We have a lot of extremely lucrative businesses here. And so we can rely on more progressive taxes than regressive taxes. We really rely on sales tax revenue, which is regressive. The gas tax is frankly regressive, right? And when it comes to funding transportation. And so fixing our tax code would be really useful because it would be more ethical in its revenue generation, but also we would have more money to spend on important things like improving our transportation system, be that high-speed rail or the light rail here or whatever it may be, right? So there's that. And then there's also the question of priorities. And I would add also land use practices are really important because, in order to sort of sustain a transit system, you do need a certain density of ridership. And so having more housing near transportation hubs is really important in allowing that housing. Like, we should not allow only one home per lot anywhere near like a transportation stop, right? Like, we need more people having access to transit. We need more housing that makes it more affordable, right? And so
And again,
it's
I
a
think this is
combination.
also, and I've argued this also, is on the other side of, for the NIMBYs, you should want to be able to upzone, because economically you can make more money off your lot. If you could build 2 more units on your lot and you still have your big house, let's not talk about whether or not in a city you should have huge houses. That's a different conversation. I don't want to be bombarded with negative comments, but
Watch out.
but economically it makes so much more sense to be able to, you could pay for your mortgage without ever paying a dime, because you have 2 renters renting out 2 apartments you build in your backyard, and you wasted space anyways. It makes no sense for NIMBYs to be fighting against it, because they can make more money and they can become even richer and continue to grow wealth for their families. It makes no sense.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, people care about their own personal aesthetics, I guess, but I care about folks having housing and folks having clean transportation options. And so that means more housing. It means more affordable housing, specifically near transit.
Awesome. Oh, thank you so much for this conversation. This conversation clearly isn't over. I have at least one other person I want to talk to about this, and then if you want to introduce me to a few people, I can have a whole conversation on high-speed rail. I would love that. If you can get me in touch with the Cascade Rail people. I would love to talk to someone, because this thing fascinates me. I want high-speed rail, whether it's just the Cascade, whether it's the route here that goes from Salem to Vancouver, or even the East Coast, East-West. Like, I would love to be able to get to the Midwest from here in a method other than an airplane.
Yeah, that becomes a federal government question, and I would love to see investments in that, and under sort of a Green New Deal framework, right? Creating an investment cycle that creates green jobs, that helps people get where they need to go and is much cleaner.
It creates not just temporary construction jobs. It creates long-term management and operations jobs as well, and well-paid positions as well.
And stuff that can be outsourced, by the way, like local jobs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. It was great having this conversation. It's a lot different than our normal conversations on this channel. I think it's an important conversation to have. Hopefully you all enjoyed a beer or 2 during this conversation. It was a little long. I hope you stick by. I'll put resources down below in the links.